The Bible tells us not to be afraid well over 300 times. Many readers of the Bible have concluded that faith and fear must necessarily displace one another. If you have fear, you don't have faith. And if you have faith, you don't have fear. You can point to dozens of verses that say it plain and clear. Fear and faith don't go together. We certainly embraced that culture during the pandemic, didn't we? You were either on team faith or team fear. There were no other options. You had to pick a side, at least in the eyes of both sides. I remember seeing a man at the grocery store last year. He was a very tall, very large, very muscular man. Like everyone else, he was wearing a mask. His mask had a message written across it. It said, "No fear." And I was really confused. Which team was he playing for? Was it team fear or team faith? I would have asked him, but as I said, he was very tall, very large, and very muscular, and I was afraid of experiencing profound bodily damage, so I didn't ask. Is it really so simple that one has to choose faith or fear? Sometimes we miss the complexity of the biblical story. There are narratives in the pages of the Bible that show faith and fear entangled in a common story. First, a little armchair psychology. Simply put, fear is an involuntary reaction to a perceived threat. It starts deep in the brain in a small area known as the amygdala. When we perceive a threat, the amygdala initiates changes in our bodies that make us ready to respond to the danger by defending ourselves or by running away. Our brains become more alert, our pupils dilate, our breathing accelerates, our heart rate and blood pressure increase, and organs that are not tied to immediate survival slow down. A fear response to threat mobilizes our internal resources to react. At the same time, two other parts of our brain, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, interpret the threat, making it possible for us to understand the nature of the threat and to possibly recognize that it's not actually a threat at all. That's why we respond very differently to a bear in the woods and a bear in the zoo. Same animal, but a different context. It's a gross oversimplification, but when that happens, our thinking brain calms down our emotional brain. We can also call them the fast brain and the slow brain. The fast brain works quickly and automatically without effort or even consciousness on our part. When we look at a picture like this, we can understand almost instantly what this person is feeling, and we can even have some sense of what is about to happen. We don't have to make a conscious choice to try to interpret this person's emotional state. It just happens. The slow brain takes time and energy and conscious attention. Trying to solve an equation like 37 times 19 requires us to remember how to perform multiplication. We have a feeling that the answer is neither 10 nor 20 million, but we know that it could be something like 642, and we have to work it out to know for sure. The answer, by the way, is 703. One of the challenges we face is that the fast brain and the slow brain sometimes disagree. For example, you may have seen this famous image, the Miller-Lyer illusion. If you've seen this before, you know that the two horizontal lines are equal in length, but it's impossible to avoid seeing one as longer than the other. The slow brain clearly understands that the lines are the same length, but the fast brain still does what it does and creates a feeling that the lines are in fact different. The key to resisting this illusion is for the slow brain, the thinking brain, to distrust the impression that the fast brain, the feeling brain, is feeding to it. A general anxiety about snakes is very common across the world. Snakes are at the top of the list of things Americans fear. Some people have an extreme fear of snakes called ophidiophobia. Any level of fear about snakes might motivate us to kill first and ask questions later. Never mind that it's illegal in our state to kill non-venomous snakes, and never mind that all snakes have a place in the ecosystems of the world. Sometimes the fear of snakes is so profound that even a picture of a snake can provoke a reaction. an intense fear response can override the rational understanding that it's just a picture. Our fast brain and slow brain, our thinking brain and feeling brain, our amygdala and prefrontal cortex don't always have the same take on an experience. On one hand, we can feel fear when fear might not be appropriate. We might perceive a threat where no threat exists, and we mobilize a fight or flight reaction that creates harm. On the other hand, we can persuade ourselves not to feel afraid when fear might save us from foolishness and suffering. Several years ago, I crushed my left thumb while working on a car because I didn't feel enough fear to follow safety protocols while jacking up the car. A little fear would have saved me a lot of pain. So it's not so simple as having no fear at all. If we live in fear 100% of the time, something is out of place. Our fear is out of order. But if we live with no fear, no sense of caution whatsoever, then we are living with unnecessary risk and possible danger. If you believe that God created human life, and I do, and if you believe that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and I do, then we have to appreciate that God designed our brains and our bodies with the capacity to feel afraid and appropriately respond to danger. In Psalm 56, we read these words, "Be gracious to me, O God, for people trample on me. All day long foes oppose me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many fight against me. O Most High, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I am not afraid. What can flesh do to me?" David wrote Psalm 56 when he was facing a bona fide threat. First, Saul, the king of Israel, was out to murder him because of his jealousy over David's fame. Second, David tried to hide in the Philistine city of Gath. You know, the place Goliath was from. Goliath, the loser in David's first and most famous act of warfare. David was famous in Philistia too, but it wasn't the good kind of fame. David was quite literally out of the frying pan and into the fire as the Philistines took him captive. David was alone, desperate, afraid, and not thinking very clearly. David was facing a legitimate threat. Saul was out to end him. It wasn't the first time either. David wasn't confused about Saul's intentions. The threat was real, and David's fear response was appropriate. In fact, I think we might say that David's amygdala got the best of his prefrontal cortex. His fear response was so strong that it overrode his judgment. He ran to find safety in the stronghold of his enemies. It's like David's thinking brain said, "Where do you want to go, David?" And his emotional brain said, "Anywhere but here." Now, there could be a sly logic to David's decision to flee to Gath. After all, Saul's agents would be in danger there as well. Maybe it was the old saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Maybe that's what he was thinking. But any assumption that we make about his thought process is just a guess. The history tells us that he wound up in captivity, and that's what we know. Psalm 56 begins with David's prayer for grace in the face of genuine danger. "Be gracious to me, O God." He cried out for divine help in the face of a man-made threat. His prayer is for grace, the undeserved mercy of God. He didn't complain by saying, "Come on, God, I don't deserve this." It was an honest prayer and a genuine admission of authentic need. If you'll allow me a brief detour, the gospel writer Matthew quoted the ancient prophecy of Isaiah when describing Jesus. "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." When life has us down, when we're in trouble, when we're in a ditch or a pit or a deep, dark cave, God cares about that. An honest prayer and a genuine admission of authentic need, they invite God into our situation. And sometimes we want to complain, "Come on, Lord, I don't deserve this." But if we face the truth that our situation is often the result of a mix of human choices, some other people's choices, some our own, and we ask for God to bring grace and mercy to bear in our mess, we find that God is our friend and ally. David's prayer goes on, "O Most High, when I am afraid." David didn't think he was invincible. David wasn't faking courage. He didn't thump his chest and say, "Fear is not an option." He was honest about his circumstance and how he felt. Anna Hampton is a cross-cultural missionary who served for nearly 2 decades in the Middle East and Asia. She shared an excerpt from an email with a pastor in Afghanistan. Fear is a normal response to threat. Like pain, it is a gift of God intended to keep us safe. Feeling guilty for feeling fear in a situation of threat is like feeling guilty for feeling hungry when you haven't eaten. It's something your body does, not your will. The challenge is to respond appropriately. She went on to say that Aristotle's view of fear is not biblical, but infuses Western church theology like a Turkish tea bag. And that when we say such things as faith is the opposite of fear, so to have fear is sin, we have more in common with Aristotelian philosophy than with biblical theology. David owned his fear, but then he went on, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." David was afraid, but he also had faith. Fear and faith occupied his mind at the same time. His fear did not displace his faith, and his faith did not displace his fear, at least not immediately. The point is not for us to be fearless. The point is for us to have faith. And what is faith? For that, I take us on another detour to Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 6. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, for whoever would approach him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. A focus on being fearless leads us to pride, to stubbornness, and even to foolishness. But faith is an act of the will to live according to the assumption that God exists and that God is faithful. David said, "I put my trust in you, O God." The psalm continues, "In God whose word I praise, in God I trust. I am not afraid. What can flesh do to me?" What David found, not in resisting fear, but in trusting God, was that he was no longer afraid. Faith, not fear, had the last word.
Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. 'Cause you are good, you're good. You're good, oh. And let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. And let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, yes, my song. 'Cause you are good, you're good. Oh, yes, you are good. Oh, you're good.
you're never gonna let me down. Oh, you're never gonna let me down. No, 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 you're never gonna let me down. You are good.
Oh, you're good. Oh, yeah, you are good. Oh, you're good. Oh, yeah, you are good. Oh, you're good.
You're never gonna let me down. No, you're never gonna let me down.
You are good. You're good. Oh, yes, you are good. Oh, you're good. Oh.
If you aren't convinced that fear is normal and that you can have faith in spite of feeling afraid, then I would remind you of Jesus. The night before he died, he stayed awake, dreading the next day. Luke's gospel tells us that Jesus was so disturbed that he literally sweat blood. He begged God to let him off the hook, to find another way forward. And yet fear and begging were not the end of the story for Jesus that night. Jesus prayed the most powerful, the most fearless prayer anyone can ever pray. Not my will, but yours be done. And angels came to fill him with peace and with resolve. Is that our prayer when we feel afraid? Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." And all of God's people say, amen.